welcome to Attendance Bias. I am your host, Brian Weinstein. My guest today on Attendance Bias is sound engineer, Phish.net contributor, and the man responsible for recent remastering of previously unreleased Phish recordings, Jeff Goldberg. Jeff chose to discuss the legendary Phish show from July 8th, 1994 at Greatwoods in Mansfield, Massachusetts. If you've been paying attention to Phish.net or just the Phish.net blog over the past few years, you may have noticed that every once in a while the site announces the release of an archival show that was previously uncirculated and unavailable to fans. To be clear, these are separate from the band's official releases. But for example, the most recent release, at least at the time of this recording, is the show from April 9th, 1990 at the Fly Me to the Moon Saloon in Telluride, Colorado. If you've listened to that show, a link to which is posted in today's show notes, you've heard Jeff's audio expertise. I've known Jeff for a while through an online Phish message board, and I've always been impressed with not only his expansive knowledge of Phish, I've also been impressed with his ability to act as an audio archeologist. He's been able to find recordings, artifacts, basically, whether he discovered them or if they were just handed to him, but he's been able to clean them up and then present it to the public. I was so curious about the nuts and bolts of remastering a poor quality tape. I was also curious about what it felt like to be one of just a few people to hear a show that is mostly unknown to the public at large. And on a personal level, I wanted to know more about his background as a Phish fan, since he's such an expert at the technical aspects and a big gearhead when it comes to Phish. More than that, I was thrilled that Jeff picked the show from Greatwoods. Although it's a pretty high-profile show, as you'll hear me mention, it was one of the first shows I ever had on tape. Very few guests, at least to this point on Attendance Bias, have brought up anything really directly related to Gamehendge. So Jeff and I relished an opportunity to talk about the band's formative rock opera. So let's join Jeff Goldberg to hear about July 8th, 1994 at Greatwoods.
Let's meet today's guest.
Jeff Goldberg, thanks so much for being on Attendance Bias. How are you?
I am great. Thank you. How about yourself?
My pleasure. I'm doing very well. I'm very excited to talk about today's show for many reasons. I'm also excited to talk about your background as an audio engineer because, well, altogether, I feel like some of this is interrelated because this show, today's show, which is July 8th, 1994 at Greatwoods, in Mansfield, Massachusetts. This is one of the first tapes I ever collected. I have a feeling that a lot of listeners who have been around for a while may have a similar experience. Not only that, but it's a Gamehendge show. More people are probably familiar with it due to the somewhat recent broadcast of it, of Dinner and a Movie. And after Gamehendge, there's a monster second set. And I'm just genuinely curious about what it's like for someone to discover and then work through a show that no one has heard before. So there's a lot going on in my head. I'm excited to talk about it.
Let's geek out, man.
Yeah, let's do it. So to start off, you grew up in, I want to make sure I pronounce this right. I know that outsiders from Massachusetts have a bad habit of mispronouncing towns. Is it Hingham, Massachusetts?
Yes, Hingham.
Hingham. All right. I got it right. Which is outside of Boston. We talked earlier, you talked about your first musical influences, which was classic rock, which was also similar to me growing up, which was very garden variety classic rock stuff. But before we get into your life as an engineer, let's talk about your life as a Phish head. How was Phish introduced into your world, Jeff? Who are we talking to?
It was the early 90s. And let's see. So I had just finished junior high and I was about to start high school. And I ended up going away to a boarding school in Connecticut. It was a pretty, it was pretty kind of crunchy, hippie-ish type of a school, one of those places. So immediately right off the bat, I was exposed to, now you'd call them jam band type music, but it was just, music that had a focus on live playing and on the improv and stuff like that. So,
and what year was this? Just so we have a sense of context.
92.
Okay, so like sort of the beginning of Horde Tour, like Blues Traveler, exactly. That kind of. Okay,
exactly, actually, and so let's see. I have two older brothers. One of them also was into Phish for a long period of time. He was first. And so I was going off to high school. He was going off to college. It was long enough ago, and the internet was young enough that kind of techno geeks and early adopters like myself and like my brother at the time, who got involved in the internet early before it became a mainstream thing, got involved in message boards and rec.music.fish.
Right, RMP.
Which was, the original incarnation of what FishNet is now, which at the end of the day was just a bulletin board system where you could post. And my brother Mark got involved in that, and he sort of became friends with a lot of the people who ran the show there, and he ended up getting involved in the administration there, and he kind of he was one of the like FishNet higher ups for a while. So when I went back for break, he was introducing me to Phish. He was like, "Hey, check this out." And he sat down, he played Junta for me. And so then that was my first exposure to it. He right off the bat got me involved with the live tapes, and I, at the time, I liked him, but I was more into the albums at the time.
Mm-hmm.
I was, I think, 14. And I just, I remember Rift got released though,
which was 1993, I think, right?
Yeah, it was in I think it was February of 93. That was my freshman. That was my freshman year. And so I was already into them enough to get the album when it came out, like waited in line at Tower Records and did that whole thing. And
I'm curious.
It just went from there.
I'm sorry to cut you off, but if, because my experience with Phish was a couple years later of me getting into them. Mine was closer to 1996. So by about 3 or 4 years later, I was also brought up on a steady diet of classic rock. And for me, what the connective tissue for Phish was kind of the Who mixed with John Fishman's arena rock style drumming in 1995, when they were starting to transition to big rock venues. Like when I saw that they covered Quadrophenia, all of a sudden it was like, okay, the world has now converged and I need to transition from the Who, which I love them so much, but they're kind of, looking back, kind of monotonous in terms of their style once they really got going in the late 60s. But Phish was the Who plus every other type of genre you could ever think of. Were there any classic rock bands for you that provided some sort of connective tissue to make this larger leap into a more diverse band?
My two favorites at the time were Rush and Pink Floyd. And I mean, and they're both progressive enough bands in some of their eras in terms of musical composition, excuse me, and a focus on longer written instrumental parts. I had been playing piano since I was really young. So I had been a musician for a long time, and I was already, I had started to play guitar already. And so there was a lot of influence in what I was listening to and to what I was learning to play. And that really kind of hit the nail on the head for me, is when it just so happened to coincide when I was learning guitar. And so the guitar parts coming from Trey really spoke to me. And, before Rift came out, I was listening to Junta and Picture Nectar. And Picture Nectar is obviously like a big kind of smorgasbord of different styles. And that is what turned me on to the fact that these guys could sing. They could do all these different styles. They were kind of goofy, but serious musicians at the same time. And I think that was the hook for me.
Do you remember your first show?
Yeah, I do.
What was it? And what do you remember from it?
It was later that year, my freshman year. It was the University of Hartford. It was April 30th, 93. And it was at I think it was called the Campus Center. It was at University of Hartford. And it was a pretty small show. It was like in a gym, basically. And it had bleachers on the sides and like those really cheap tied together chairs and stuff. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I totally remember the show. And the thing that was cool is I had already been listening to them for for a year or two. And so I knew a lot of the songs already. And Rift, as I mentioned earlier, had just come out a couple months before, and I had been, like just wearing that thing out. And so because it was sort of a rift tour, they were going, and I got a lot of songs that I knew. And so that, I think that played into a lot of the immediate live band hooked. I was really impressed by how well they played the songs from the album, and they really sounded just like the album, except for better. And so finally I got what my brother was talking about.
To fast forward all the way to 2021, or whenever the last time you saw them was, obviously it wasn't 2021 as we're recording this in April. Do you still feel that way as a fan? To you, is it still important that they nail the composed sections?
Yes. And it's funny too, because it's, that was a huge detractor for me for a long time. I mean, it wiped 2.0 off the map for me, basically. I think that Trey's story is remarkable, in terms of his recovery and all that, and how he basically had to relearn the entire catalog. And, but at the same time, he had to relearn the entire catalog, and it's never quite been the same. And when I say it's never quite been the same, the reason I say that is because the band's accuracy with things like the composed sections and attention to detail of those things is part of what attracted me to them.
I think a lot of fans who got into the band in the early or mid 90s feel similarly to the way you're describing. I sometimes get that way, but when I'm at the show, I won't say I don't care, because a botched song is a botched song, and it does make me, it does give me goosebumps in not the best way, as my students would say, cringe. But at the same time, it's easily forgivable when you're there, I think.
Yeah.
I don't know. Do you feel similarly, or do you disagree?
So as I was saying, it depends on where the error occurs and what the context is of it. And, so for what I was saying I had given Trey a pass basically on anything that I heard. And I would hear I thought that I would hear every error that was played, because it would just, being a person that was learning guitar and being kind of persnickety in the way that I am about sound and stuff, I would hear if there was an error in the composed section and whatever. And it was fine until he had to start over Yem.
Yeah. And where was that again?
It was at the Garden. It was at Fleet Center, I think it was called at the time.
Yeah, the Boston Garden, not Madison Square Garden.
Pretty sure it was at the 20th anniversary show. I can't remember which it was, but it was like he had to stop You Enjoy Myself and start over, because it was like he'd butchered it so badly, and I couldn't believe it. It was like that was the beginning of the end for me, in terms of the faith that they would nail stuff.
And you brought up a few times how you could be persnickety and how into sound you are, and how when you grew up, you were learning to play instruments. Let's dive into that a little bit, about your background as a sound engineer and how you eventually kind of became this go-to person on Phish.net and just in the community to release previously uncirculated material. So how did you first get into the business, or just the background of being a sound engineer?
Well, I've always been into sound and music. I think it started because my mother was also a school teacher, and she played piano and she was musical. So being a school teacher, she wanted to expose her kids to every type of extracurricular activity to see what it was that we took an interest in, and, different sports and different swimming lessons and this and that and the other thing. But because she played the piano and she was a school teacher, and she had a strong belief that people who played piano at a very young age had more skills in other areas later in life, math and other things like that, which in retrospect, I completely agree with. She told me I'd thank her, and I have multiple times. And so it just becomes sort of part of your being. And whether that was coincidental or cause and effect reason, I now have what's called synesthetic hearing, which means that when I hear sounds, I see colors in my head, which it helped me a lot through music classes and things like that. But it makes listening to music and being a sound engineer a very interesting thing to do.
I would imagine Phish shows must be super fun for you. Kuroda's got nothing on your own head, I would imagine.
Kinda. I mean, like the light shows are great for me because they're very similar to what I experience in my head.
And how did this become a career for you? How did it turn from being 4 years old and enjoying, playing piano and learning? I would imagine to sense patterns is probably a good way
Yeah.
to help a 4-year-old develop
learning
mental
to play
person.
stuff by ear. I'd
Right.
hear a song and go to the piano and figure it out. So, other than those kind of cool things, being able to play music games and things like that, I guess this is the first audio project I ever did. I was really into Pink Floyd at a young age, and on the wall, there's a song Empty Spaces, where in the left track, there's a backwards message. And like, you can hear it very faintly. I think it's the left speaker during Empty Spaces. And it's, garbled nonsense sounding. I remember wanting to figure out what they were saying. And so I took the audio tape and I actually took a pencil and unraveled the magnetic material and flipped it backwards and retaped it with Scotch tape. Really not knowing what I was doing. No one told me how to do this. I just was playing around with it. And I couldn't believe that it worked. It totally worked. I played the tape and I heard the backwards message. And I was I was sold after that on working with sound. It just was awesome. I think I was 11 when I did that, something like that. I was pretty young.
In what way did these two worlds kind of not convalesce, but how do they converge? The idea of you enjoying sound engineering and putting sounds together and figuring them out, plus your interest in Phish. Where did that intersect?
Well, as I mentioned, I got involved with Phish.net pretty early on because of my brother. And I ended up meeting a lot of those guys at my brother at a graduation party in 95. And all the Phish.net people were there. And so that's when I met them. And then
who were they? Who was there?
Charlie Dirksen and Zizix and Marcy from and Ellis, Noah Cole. And there was a ton of people. It was a big party. Mm-hmm. So then I went to school in DC and Noah and Marcy lived down there, and we ended up going to the Hampton shows together, and I stayed with them. And when we went to the Hampton shows, I stayed with all the Phish.net people.
Which Hampton shows? What year is this?
This was 96 through 98. Okay. 96, 97, 98. 96 was just a one show. And then 97 was a two show. And then I think it was 98 3. I don't know.
98 was two. I remember from Hampton Comes Alive. It was the back-to-back shows.
Whatever it was, those were amazing. Those are on my list of talking about today, in fact. But so I already knew them, and they knew I played guitar, and they knew I worked with sound and stuff like that. I had a band at the time. I played, and they went and saw the band, and so fast forward to, and I've been in touch with Charlie. I've been friends with Charlie, and he came to events of mine, engagement party and whatever. So someone had sent Charlie a tape that hadn't been circulated. This was the Penny Post show. I think it was 125.90. And this was back in September of 16, I believe. And at the time, my dad had recently passed away, and I was starting my own sound business. And Charlie was like, "Hey, can you do anything with this?" And I was like, totally. So coming from the era of tape trading, it was having a good sounding show was gold.
It really was. And
it was just awesome.
Yeah. I've brought this up on previous episodes that I think we take it for granted now that almost everything that Phish has ever recorded that used to be on physical media is now accessible in your pocket. I don't know if I can call it a lost art, but there's certainly a nostalgic twinge to it, to the idea of you were just talking about, of finding a tape that has the initials SBD next to it, or at least a first generation of a good audience recording.
There was a mystique about it, and it was you held the best shows as bait to get other really good sounding shows. I'm not going to lie. In the same sense that the accuracy of nailing all the composed sections has entered a new era, so to speak. So has a lot of this other stuff. And it the changes to things like collecting tapes and being able to get the whole catalog at the touch of a button. I've asked myself, would I have gotten as into Phish if it was like today, and I don't think I would. There was something like underground about the tape trading and collecting, that you were a part of something cool that not a lot of people knew about. But if you did know somebody that knew about it, it was like you were in. Like you were immediately friends with them, and I can't explain it. It just was
I think a lot of it has to do with a personality type, and of course, Phish fans have all different personality types. But it's not surprising to me that a lot of Phish fans who I've met are very much into Tolkien or George R.R. Martin or Star Wars. You know, all these kind of science fiction fantasy ideas where authors create a closed world where there's always more to learn, but you kind of have to do your own research a little bit, and then you feel some sense of ownership over it. I think that's a huge part of it, because when you find a tape like Ian's Farm, for example, or Amy's Farm, that were the tapes that I remember having were pristine quality, but you could still hear the dogs barking in the background, I think, of Ian's Farm. There's just something like you feel like you're there, and you're not going to find it anywhere else. You're not going to find it at Tower Records or Strawberries or wherever else you look. You're only going to find it through your own perseverance and contacts. And I think that has a sense of ownership, as opposed to today, like you were just saying, where anyone could download an app. Anyone who has fingers can find a show, and you're almost paralyzed by choice.
You also couldn't skip, like the concept of skipping songs.
Yeah.
Like blew my mind when people started trading shows on CD. I was like, wait, there was definitely a sense of like, I loved skipping Sparkle or whatever, but there was something about having to listen to the whole show. You know, like about you put on the tape and you just listened to it. And like, yeah, occasionally you could master the art of the fast forward play game, but like, I bet I can get the fast forward right to the end of my soul. Whatever.
Yeah, no, you got to take your medicine. You know, it's like the 5794 show at the Bomb Factory, the Tweezer Fest. They opened the set with Loving Cup, right? And then they played Sparkle before Tweezer. I think I have that right without checking. But on tape, you couldn't just fast forward to the Tweezer. You had to take your medicine. You know, it's good stuff. You had to listen to Loving Cup and you had to listen to Sparkle before you get to what you're there for, really. So I think you're right. I think there's something to that. And so you brought up that you received a show from January 25th, 1990. Yes. I have to ask you, going back to that idea of remastering and then releasing a previously uncirculated Phish show, what is it like to be one of the only people in the entire community, arguably, to make it dramatic, on Earth, who has access to something that previously no one has and finds it, and I would imagine a lot of people find it very valuable? Is there any sort of thrill to that? Do you do it for the thrill, or is it for
huge thrill? Yeah, no, there's absolutely a huge thrill in it. I don't know if the thrill would be the same, again, if the context were transposed to me having not had the background that I did with the tapes and stuff, because at the time when we were collecting tapes and listening to them, and this was back when people would sit and listen to music as an activity, you know, like we would be like, hey, let's listen to that show. And
you described my entire high school experience.
Yeah. And it was like, you know, it's so times have changed. Let's just put it that way. So, yeah. And people have changed. I mean, I'm a lot older. I don't have time to do that anymore, but like, that was great, you know, to be able to put on a show and sit around and listen to it. We'd banter about stuff like, man, don't you wish you could just like squeegee off the hiss or like, or like get rid of that. Like, what is that buzz that I'm hearing? Or I wish that you could turn the bass up. So like, we used to fantasize, literally used to fantasize about being able to take these tapes and like, make them sound like the way that they should sound. Now I can kind of do that. And so when I go back and take these tapes that I didn't, a lot of them I didn't listen to at the time because they weren't there, but like the same era of the tapes that I was listening to when I first started listening to the band and stuff, and actually being able to, load the sound of the computer and see it visually in full color, especially given the synesthesia thing. Not that they have any correlation with each other, but it's still like I see things in colors anyway. So like when you're doing a spectral analysis of whatever it is, being able to be like, there's the hiss and then remove it, or, you know, there's the buzz. I can actually see the line at that frequency that's causing that, and go in there and take a paintbrush and remove it. and have it sound just as good. So like, there's the glass half full of the digital stuff. Like you'd never be able to do that before.
And for people who are interested, what are some of the shows that they could find on Phish.in or write-ups on Phish.net that you have had a hand in remastering?
I think that the big one that got the most press was the Colorado 88 completion, which was Colorado 88 was one of the live albums that the band released. Those shows came from a set of tapes that a now friend of mine, Neil, like Paige had a couple of the band members he lived in Colorado at the time, and they crashed at his place and they like used his deck to copy the tapes that Paul had done or whatever. And so he made copies of the tapes for himself. And then like, those were the only copies that existed. And somehow the band didn't have the copies. And so they ended up having to go back to him and be like, so, you know, those tapes that you have? And so he had all those originals. And so he was the one that provided the band those tapes that they ended up releasing Colorado 88 with, but they didn't release the complete shows. It was just a mix. It was like a mix of highlights that they released out of these. I don't know. It was like 4 or 5 shows, 6 shows, maybe. So Neil had gotten in touch with Charlie. I can't remember the how they got connected, but Charlie reached out to me because I'd already done a couple things for them. And he was like, this is a big one. And so I worked for a long time on those shows are where I really learned how to like fix everything up. Cause I went through 3 or 4 drafts of them where I was posting them to Charlie, and he was like, well, let's try to do it a little bit more like this, giving me some feedback. And eventually I got them to, in my opinion, sound really good.
They do.
And then in the end, I actually think they sound just as good as the released stuff.
Is your mix the basis of the album that was officially released?
What I released is the remainder of what they released.
Oh, I see. Got it.
Whoever did the cleanup work on their end did it for them. I did it for the rest of the stuff.
You did it for everyone else.
Right. For the rest of the songs that like didn't make it on the Colorado 88 album. That didn't circulate really.
When was this show played?
So before we get to the show itself, let's talk about the context in which it was played. Summer 1994, and then we'll get into kind of the meat of the first set, which is Gamehendge, of course. But looking at 1994, at least the summer, Phish played 29 shows during the summer tour and 124 shows overall in the year. And with only a few exceptions, it seems like the summer tour, at least to my eyes, and I'd like you to correct me if I'm wrong or add your own thoughts, it was when they sort of made the jump to play large outdoor sheds as opposed and amphitheaters on the East Coast, most of which are venues that the fans today are familiar with, like Jones Beach, for example, Holmdel, of course, Great Woods, Walnut Creek, SPAC. But as you go farther west and away from the Northeast and New England especially, like they didn't go farther west than Colorado in 94, at least in the summer of 94, but they were still playing mid-size outdoor venues and theaters like Red Rocks, the State Theater in Kalamazoo. I got corrected on this one. I think it's the Murat Amphitheater. I think I pronounced it wrong in an earlier episode. That's in Indianapolis. So I saw it as like an in-between year of growth for Phish, where they kind of tailored their tour to their relative popularity in each part of the country, as opposed to now where Live Nation just kind of sets up 10 or 12 venues where they're going to do 2 or 3 nights apiece. And I think it's very telling that the band started the year at the Beacon Theater in New York City, and then they sold out Madison Square Garden by the end of the year on December 30th.
Which I remember that at the time, marveling at that. Like I consciously thought that.
Yeah, the contrast.
Yes, because it was, I mean, I saw a lot of shows in 94. I mean, I was with the band. It's the year I saw the most shows, I think. 94 or 95, those two. But yeah, I mean, it was definitely a transition year for them in a ton of different respects. I mean, they had They had new gear, like ton of new gear. With all this new gear that they had, I mean, as you know, Page got his piano the year before.
Yeah,
and
in the
so
spring
it kind
of 1993, right?
So from there, it just every tour they were making major additions to the sound. So that in tandem with having to learn how to play these different size rooms, and the reason that Phish had such a over time like smooth transition going from the bars to the clubs to the theaters is because of these types of years where they would have these like one step up begin to get peppered in with the tours, and they would sort of learn not just how to play to the room itself, but how to use the sound of the room as part of the show. You can really hear it too, because if you listen to a lot of the shows in 93, at least the soundboard ones, you can hear a lot of digital delay. You know, like if you listen to the Roxy 93 live Phish show, it's a really good example of it. That's the first show that Page used his piano. The delay on their vocals is crazy.
It's absurd.
It just doesn't, but that's what they used for the room. That in tandem with them recording a live one very consciously, and them going into it like, let's just record the whole year, on 24 track digital, and digital recording was still kind of new. We'll make a mix out of it, make a mix show. That was so premeditated that I think that it not only affected their choice of venue that they selected to book, affected what songs they chose to play throughout the tours. It affected things like their stage game, things like playing Gamehendge twice within a month or whatever it was.
Yep. And they stopped doing things like the Big Ball Jam.
Yeah.
Right. And so speaking of the songs that they were playing, Hoist was released on March 29th, 94. So that's just a couple months before today's show. And so the summer tour was filled with tracks from that album, including, but certainly not limited to, Sample in a Jar, Down with Disease, Julius, Wolfman's Brother. If you went to 3 or 4 shows in 1994, you would almost hear, out of those 4 songs, you would certainly hear all of them. I think in 3 shows, it's pretty fair to say without literally checking the stats. And tonight's show was the first night of a 2-night run at Great Woods. And by the time I saw them in 97 was my first show, but really kicked it up later in the 90s. A lot of these venues that we just mentioned had become regular stops on summer tour, like these larger venues like Jones Beach or SPAC, for example. And they were playing large venues throughout the country by the late 90s. It was a given that Phish wouldn't play anything less than, the big shed in your area. So what was it like seeing them in the early years of large venues as opposed to when I hopped on, where it was more taken for granted?
Every year their venues so I started listening to them in 92, started going to shows in 93, and and listened and went to shows every year consistently. I was at like every New Year's show until 2000, and so I was pretty heavy 1.0 like tour goer. I think that every year there were 2 things that my friends and I, when we would go to the shows, would kind of like, I used the word marvel before, but we're in awe of, I guess, how much better they got musically with every tour. Like they just like, especially for me as a learning guitar player, Trey played the guitar in my mind the way that one should play the guitar. Like it was like, he like did it correctly. It was like, that's the way you're supposed to play that instrument, is the way that I kind of viewed it at the time. Every tour he was better and better, and the band was tighter and tighter, and like, and then the bass got higher in the mix and stuff, and the sound was getting better. The other thing that we were marveling at is how big the venues were getting. And I remember seeing them. I was at New Year's 93 at the Centrum. We were like, I can't believe they're playing for like 15,000 people. It just like, it blew our mind at the time.
Set 1.
All right, so let's talk about 7/8/94. The show that you chose for today, which starts with a first set. I hesitate to use the word composed, but certainly a planned ahead version of Gamehendge, fully narrated with all the bells and whistles are in it. Before we get into the song by song breakdown, I'd like to ask you what Gamehendge meant to you at the time, and what does it mean to you now? Because I'll
Loaded
tell
question.
you, yeah, you know what? I'll take the brunt. I'll answer it first, and then you
Okay.
can jump in with yours. I think at its essence, Gamehendge is the bane of all Phish songs for the first, I don't know, 8 years of their career. I think it was a good toolbox for them. It's the ultimate white whale of Phish. I think people even now say that, oh my God, do you think they'll ever do Gamehendge again? You know, it's never far from people's thoughts. And I think it was elemental in their career in that it started by creating this unbreakable bond between the band and its fans. Because as I brought up earlier, that whole idea of a closed world created by the author, whether it's The Lord of the Rings or any number of other fantasy science fiction, this is Phish's version of that, where even if you're into Phish, you have to be into Gamehendge to get all the references in a multitude of songs. So it kind of, you're in on a secret, I think is what a big appeal of it is. Lots of fans, you know, they say how like all of Phish is kind of an inside joke. And I think Gamehendge like reinforces that in a very tangible degree. At the same time, it's a very simple, silly little fairy tale that, in my opinion, and I know you may disagree, it's got holes all over the place, plot wise. It was written by a college student. Theme wise, same thing, but it does create a starting point. I think people get into Phish for all sorts of reasons, where people, like you mentioned way earlier, that people love progressive rock and that Phish has that kind of appeal and musical dexterity. I think the sense of collegiality among fans, that there's like the party scene and it's just plain fun to go, the storytelling and the inside jokes, or just a combination of all of them. And Gamehendge is the storytelling inside jokes to the max. And so now it's just kind of like, it's a thing that's part of Phish, but it's not a big part of Phish anymore.
I'd say it's retired at this point.
Yeah, I think that's fair. For you in 1994, what was it?
Oh man. At that point, I was already a big fan, like going to multiple live shows, had a collection already. So, I mean, I was well aware of what Gamehendge was because my brother had sat me down and like played The Man Who Stepped In Yesterday and gone through the whole story with me and stuff. Coupled with the fact that I'm, as you mentioned before, I'm one of your typical Phish fans who's into Star Wars and Lord of the Rings and into like Joseph Campbell's Hero of a Thousand Faces and all like that type of stuff, like as storytelling mechanisms. I was very into. I agree with you that there's something kind of JV about that it's a little unpolished. I sort of get the sense that he had something that was a project that was due and ended up like pulling a bunch of different stuff together that he had written and like putting that together.
I have the same exact feeling. One time when I was in college, my roommate was a film major and he was the type of person who put off all of his projects and then rushed.
I can totally see Trey being like that.
Yeah.
I mean, he got booted out of school for what, a joke or something, for playing a prank on somebody with a
with a human hand.
Yeah. Yeah. With like that's gross. So,
yeah,
like dude screwed around. I've done it myself with papers, in my high school, where I take like a bunch of old papers that I did and like take all the best sections and you make a mix or whatever. So I think the best example of that is the fact that Possum is on there. Like it's so wildly out of place.
Yeah, because it was a Jeff Holdsworth song.
Completely. And like clearly they just added that first verse in and stuck it on there. They're like, we need to add more time or something, because it was like, there's nothing to do with Gamehendge.
And at the same time, as we can kind of toss it off as what is very likely kind of a last minute project and throw things in for running time, it's also very uniquely special. Totally. I think I got to double check this, but I think they've only done a complete Gamehendge run through 4 times. 5. Okay. I think this was the last one, right? The one that we're talking about today.
Yeah. And it was what a gift it was.
So the set starts off with Llama, which my understanding from reading the Phish.net song history and probably way back to the Phish Compendium by Dean Budnick is that it's not directly related to the Gamehendge saga as part of the narrative, but it's kind of takes place in a future Gamehendge looking back. And I thought it was very funny that even at 3 minutes, like llama is usually around 4 minutes or so. At 3 minutes, there's when you corrected me, I called it the loop. This kind of sound, this woo, woo, woo. It's like police siren sort of thing that will eventually melt into N2O, which will then lead us to Gamehendge. All of Llama isn't even 4 minutes long.
It's a fiery version, though. It's good.
Yeah, any show that kicks off with Llama is, I'm in. Sign me up. And then they get into N2O, which Mike starts as like the dentist role where he says, feeling a little drowsy, open wide, don't bite, don't bite. And so right from the start, something is up, right? Did you have that sense in the crowd, if you remember at the time? Because I've only seen
I
one.
knew the moment I knew something was up was when Trey said there's a 52-year-old man sitting in a dentist chair. And when he said that, I instantly knew what was happening because it was a little bit weird. Like Nitrous is a weird song.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
It's like,
it's one of the weirdest.
And so, I definitely knew something was up.
Yep.
When that was going on. It's a rare song to begin with.
Sure. And so Trey says, as you alluded to, there's a 50-year-old man in a dentist chair. And the quote that stuck out to me was, "Welcome to the dream, everybody." And that's like, everyone, like a preschool teacher saying, "All right, everyone sit on the rug, get your juice, it's story time."
Yeah. And
they go right into lizards after Trey just kind of introduces all the principal characters of the story.
The name of this guy is Colonel Foreman. Colonel Foreman is looking down this long corridor as he sits in the dentist chair. And he's feeling the throbbing, and as he kind of drifts off into fantasy land, he sees this corridor opening up in front of his eyes, and he starts to pass through. And as he goes through, he walks along kind of inside of his mind, and we can all kind of go with him through this corridor until he runs into this knight that's leaning up against the wall. The knight turns to him and introduces himself. He says his name is Rutherford the Brave.
And at this point, I was wondering if the plot of Gamehendge would work nearly as well without any narration, because Lizards is a beautiful song. It's filled with catchy melodies. It's got great sing-along lyrics. That ending is one of the most beautifully written parts in all of the Phish canon, in my opinion. I just wondered at that time if it would just work well as a song cycle, as opposed to Trey just jumping in the middle in between songs with narrative.
On the original recording of The Man Who Stepped In Yesterday, during that beautiful guitar part, there's this long narration coming out of one of the speakers where he describes Rutherford the Brave, jumping in the water and the suit of arms, and beyond just the regular lyrics of the song, which gives a little bit of exposition to what's going on there. So without that, and he's obviously not going to do that narration in the middle of the song or whatever.
Right.
So that kind of just gets skipped. And so I can understand over time where that would kind of feel like you're missing out on that first part of the character building parts of the story. And
I think that's kind of, as we move on to the next narration before Tila and Wilson, I think that might be kind of the fatal flaw of any rock opera, generally speaking. Whether it's, I mentioned I'm a big fan of The Who, where Pete Townsend wrote Tommy, or Lifehouse, or Quadrophenia, Roger Waters and The Wall, where it makes sense to the person writing it, but just it doesn't, there's not enough there. And you have to find the exact right medium to express what's actually happening, as opposed to just playing a bunch of killer songs in a row.
I mean, it's probably the reason that they stopped doing it.
So they move on to Tila, which even for a ballad, there's some incredible shredding toward the very end. That unbelievable part when you said, as a younger fan, you said this is the way the guitar should be played. I had that same thought at the end of Tila. It just kills.
breezes whisper.
And then things start to come together when Trey takes an extra narration to talk about the revolution. He introduces who Wilson and Tila are. And then it turns, in my head at least, into an actual story. And then when they played Wilson, we're not fully at the Wilson chant just yet. I feel like this was on the precipice of when the Wilson chant was being developed by the audience. Do you remember whether or not people were chanting it?
This was the year of this type of thing, like becoming solidified. You know, the Stash Clap was forming at the same time as this. I was at the MSG show at 12/30/94, and that was the first show where I actually heard the Wilson chant in full effect. And it was really cool at the time. It was like, but no, they were still just doing the dun dun.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the Wilson chant, obviously, like it comes from the original recording of The Man Who Stepped In Yesterday, when you can hear, you know, they do the like, Wilson.
Yeah. That was pretty good. That was pretty good. So, but yeah, so they after Wilson, there's there's narration between every song, after every single song. Trey is our narrator. They played AC/DC Bag, which is a pretty standard AC/DC Bag with a killer outro. Although I thought to myself, is it fair to call anything standard in this set, which is by definition, in my opinion, a special set, capital S in both words. You know, this is kind of what at least I hope for when I go to see Phish. But you had a different read on AC/DC Bag, right? You found something really special about it?
Yeah, AC/DC Bag is that was the moment. So just to backtrack a little bit, anyone who watched, you can see this happen. Anyone who watched the dinner and a movie of the show, Mike ends up having some type of a sound issue with his bass. I'm not sure what it is, but in the middle of Lizards, and he motions towards one of the stage techs, and they give him a different bass. And so like the bass cuts out in the middle of Lizards for like 20 seconds or something like that. It starts back up. I think it's during the first chorus or something. But the bass that they gave him was a modulus bass as opposed to his Languedoc bass that he, you know, used standard at the time. A modulus bass is what he switched to back in 97, back in the like funk days.
The winter 97, the show that was on Slip Stitch and Pass, I think was one of his first shows playing with the modulus, if I remember.
It was those were from the Europe shows from the summer of 97. And that's when they were like, you know, he was traveling with, presumably he traveled with a different bass. And so he got that bass for that. But in any event, that AC/DC Bag is like the first time I was able to distinguish each instrument separately in a live context. And I'm not sure if it was as a result of them just playing tighter, playing on a bigger stage, performing differently because they knew they were being recorded, or if it was because of the switch to the modulus bass. But I was like, I just looked at my friend and I was like, they sound incredible. They sounded so good. And that bag is when I realized it. I was like, God damn, they fucking rip.
And it really came through. I agree with you toward the end of Bag, and the rest of the set is served so well. Next up is Forbin's Mockingbird, which is, I think, overall my favorite of all the songs, and maybe the best mix of kind of plot exposition and musical dexterity put together. I love these songs. Whenever they started at a show, I'm just automatically, it's one of the best shows I've ever seen, just because they played Forbin's and Mockingbird. More narration, and then they get to the sloth. And in my notes, I wrote that, again, this is standard, but jams or exceptional versions of songs are irrelevant in this set. It's not the point.
Right.
You know, we're not there at this point to hear the best sloth ever. Like I don't think that that's relevant. You know, the point is the narrative whole, that the band is kind of treating their hometown crowd to something that everybody knows is special, because by 94, as you mentioned, everyone's kind of in on it.
Yeah. I think that, I mean, for me, and obviously the band too, the sound was the star of the night. And again, I'm not sure if if it was due to anything that I listed before in particular, or just a conglomeration of all of that. But when sound is the primary focus of what the band is working on because of a live album or whatever it is, sign me up, because like, that's why I got into the band.
They close the set with McGrupp and then Divided Sky, where Trey explains that Divided Sky is a prayer, a quote unquote prayer that everyone in Gamehendge used to do before the story ever took place. And what a Divided Sky this is.
If you, just for anyone listening, if you've not heard this version of Divided Sky, listen to it. It's fire. It's so good. As soon as you think it's going to end, they do like 3 more.
It's not even too much of a good thing. It's just a lot of a good thing.
So good. It's one of my favorite versions.
Set 2.
Set 2 is more of a conventional Phish set in terms of the set list, and that there's no narrative. There's nothing like nothing special in terms of a cohesive whole, but it's a hell of a set. It opens with Rift, and on the Phish.in recording, this is the first thing I noticed. I'm glad we're talking about the sound so much, that the first set is an audience recording. The second set on this website, or re-listen, is a soundboard.
Which is, again, that I assumed that it was the audience one, because I think it was for a long time. Soundboards didn't circulate at the show. To the point where when Dinner and a Movie was broadcast, I actually recorded the audio from it because I was excited to have a soundboard version of the show.
Sure. After Rift, they play Sample in a Jar, which is perfect for 1994. I thought it sounds like the album version, but with much more verve. And I listened to it again today before our recording. And man, they are having such a good time playing Sample in a Jar, the Hoist songs in general. And it's just Gamehendge, I thought the whole set, it's such a delight, but it definitely requires patience, and it requires a bit more organization than I think the band is used to. And this Sample in a Jar, to me, it's just like, all right, let's cut loose. You know, Fishman is going nuts on the cymbals. He's in love with his China cymbal for this whole year, I think. This version of Sample is like, all right, now we're here for a party. The first set was a performance. Now it's a party.
That's a good way of describing it. The second set was awesome. I mean, this show is probably my favorite regular show. Like with, I'm not talking about Big Cypress or festivals or things like that. It's between this and one of the Hamptons, but man, the combo of getting a Gamehendge in the first set and getting a second set like this with the versions of the songs that are in there, it's just...
Well, the versions of the songs, next up is Reba, which is a great version. It's, first of all, there's Manteca teases all over it. which I think is just kind of all right, move it up a notch. We got Manteca. It's just so smooth with a great tight jam. And I was wondering your take on the next song, which is Yerushalayim Shel Zahav, which is a rarity now, without a doubt. I thought this was very odd placement. I can understand if they wanted to play a cool down song. I wonder why they picked this one. Any ideas or what it was like? Because they played this only 12 times total, and they haven't played it since New Year's Eve 94.
I'm guessing that it's just, I know that at the time they were focusing a lot on their vocals, especially in some of the bluegrass stuff. Later in the year, they ended up touring with Reverend Jeff Mosier, who at the time was, I think they were taking lessons with him on singing vocals, because when they were recording Hoist, I think Fishman actually had some legit singing parts for the first time on the album. And I think that he actually liked the experience, something along those lines, where Fishman was no longer just going to be the Henrietta mocking himself singing bit with a vacuum. He actually wanted to take part in the vocals of the songs for real. They were into doing things like taking lessons from professionals in whatever, like they learned when they were toured with Santana, they learned how to do a lot of the Latin sounding stuff.
Yeah. Fishman is credited with the Shirley Temple in the liner notes of Hoist for Wolfman's Brother. And I just remembered as we were talking, Yerushalayim Shel Zahav is performed at the end of Demand. And up next is It's Ice, which is a flawless performance of the composed part. And then right when they get to the jam, it could go anywhere. This is really great funk. This is like edgy funk.
With the piano, the funky piano with the wah in the background.
Yep. Page very much leads the way on this.
And the drums drop out for a little bit.
Excellent.
It's a killer version of this.
Yep. And the centerpiece, in my opinion, of the second set is Stash, which I'm guessing most fans are familiar with since it's the version that was eventually used on a live one. And there are parts in this Stash that, for me, it's the template for all stashes that I heard after. To me, every stash should compare to the version on a live one. And now it was different for me. Even though I've heard this show before, I didn't listen to it as intently as I did for this episode of the podcast. It's just fun to hear it in a sequence of another show, as opposed to hearing it on a live one.
Right.
What I mean?
It's funny because when you're listening to the show and you hear it in the sequence of the actual show, it almost sounds out of context. Like you're almost like, wait, that sounds just like it is.
Right. I know this, but not from here.
Right. I love Stash in general. I have a place in my heart for Stash, as you may know or may not know, or anyone listening may not know or know. In the original Phish Companion and on the Fishnet site, there's a truncated version of it now, but I'm the one that wrote the song history for Stash. I was studying jazz at the time, and I was learning a lot about what was going on when Trey was writing Stash. with a live one, I think that they were trying to, at the time, they were trying to cover a lot of different in the live album release. They're trying to, much like a Picture Nectar sort of was a genre coverage album showing what they could do in terms of their spread of different genres. This was sort of like, this was going to be a lot of people's referent for what they sounded like as a live band. And so I think they wanted to hit on all fronts in terms of their different types of songs and stuff that they do.
I think they were successful. I mean, how many people cite a live one as either what got them into Phish or what kind of set up their fandom for loving all those songs, you know, like when you bring up Slave to the Traffic Light, at least me, my first thought of it is, oh, a live one.
Well, just hearing an actual officially released live, like soundboard, best sounding thing you'd ever heard from them, basically, and being able to skip the, you know, like to the song you wanted, it just was awesome.
Yeah. So after that beautiful, incredible, all-time great stash was next, in my opinion, the most beautiful, incredible, all-time great segues, which is You Enjoy Myself into Frankenstein, back into You Enjoy Myself. Unbelievable. How do they do this? I mean, Trey just starts playing the riff for Frankenstein. I mean, then this is after a flawless composed You Enjoy Myself, by the way. And they just go,
a killer, yeah.
Yeah, it is.
So good.
It just sounded so intuitive to me and yet spontaneous.
Yeah, and they're so tight at the time that it's like a pleasure to listen to, you know. Yeah, you're right. It sounds premeditated.
But it doesn't. You know what I mean? Like it does and it doesn't at the same time, because when Trey starts with the that main Frankenstein riff that was very much in my DNA from watching Beavis and Butthead for the year or two before I got into Phish, you could hear Fishman pick up on it immediately. And then he does it maybe 2 or 3 more times before. I don't remember this on the dinner and a movie, but I could just picture Trey looking around, giving a little nod and maybe holding up one finger. And then they all just jam right into Frankenstein. Again, a flawless performance of Frankenstein, where it's also the only time that Fishman, at least to my ears, has ever extended the drum solo. So I'm going home happy as a drummer.
Yeah, it's it's such a good second set. And the lights were down at this point. The sun was down, yeah. The lights were up, and you're in full second set mode at this point. It was just, everyone was in bliss because you had just gotten a Gamehendge. You were getting one song after another of just like a killer set list. And
killer performances, not just on paper, but like the meat was there.
Yeah. Yeah.
And to close up the whole show, not the whole show, but the whole set, it was a great pairing of Julius and Golgi. You know, it's something that you would see at a show today. Great closers. The encore, they came out with Nellie Kane. As you brought up, they were very much into their bluegrass vocal harmonies, which Nellie Kane is my favorite of all the bluegrass songs they play. And they closed with Cavern, which is, the classic, one of their better set or show closers. And it almost always means that the show is over, or at least that it's ending soon. So walking out of the show, what was going on? Who were you with and what were you thinking?
There's so many funny stories about this. So I was at summer camp and I was a CIT that year. So I was 16. And at the time, when you're CIT at the camp I went to, you don't get to go out to concerts at night and stuff. You're just basically like a glorified camper.
Right.
But
counselor in training.
right. But before the summer, I preemptively, me and a friend of mine had called the camp director. My brother was friends with his son. And like I had said, there's this concert. Just wanted to like preemptively get your permission to go to this thing. And so we went to the top in terms of permission, got his permission. And like the CIT director at the time was so pissed because like we had already, preemptively gotten permission to go to the show and we were the only two and everyone else had to stay at camp or whatever. I remember it was especially special because of that. It was like, and we went with all the older counselors and I went with my brother was there and it was a lot of fun. So yeah, walking out of the show afterwards was like that feeling of what the hell just happened? Like what, that really just happened?
If there's a show that can make you feel totally fine and content, even while waiting to get out of a Great Woods parking lot, I would imagine this would be it, because that's the worst parking lot I've ever waited to get out of after a Phish show.
It's pretty bad. So yeah, it didn't even affect that. So pretty good show.
So Jeff Goldberg, thank you so much for being on Attendance Bias. You picked a hell of a show to talk about. I haven't had a lot of conversations about Gamehendge yet so far on this podcast, so I'm really glad we got the opportunity. So I just want to say thanks again.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. I had a good time.
And that's it for today's episode with Jeff Goldberg. Now, it's pretty obvious that Jeff is, I don't know if anyone is really an expert on Phish, but he certainly knows his way around the band. He knows about their history, he knows about their gear, and what's most impressive to me is his ability to take facts and discussion points and place them within a larger pattern and narrative about the band in context of their whole history. So as a result, I'm not surprised that Jeff and I threw out a lot of facts and a lot of information about today's show during our discussion. But of course, as always happens, there's points of confusion, points of correction, and that leads to today's Attendance Bias Fact Check.
Attendance Bias Fact Check.
Jeff says that he first got into Phish through their albums, and at the time that he got into the band, Rift had just been released. He remembers that the album was released in February of 1993, and he's exactly right. Rift was released on February 2nd, 1993. Happy Groundhog's Day, everybody! Jeff's first show was on April 30th, 1993, at what he remembers as being called the Campus Center at the University of Hartford. According to Phish.net, it was called the Sports Center. Jeff says that because it was a tour to promote the Rift album, the band played a lot of songs from Rift. He's exactly right about this too. In fact, the band played 7 tracks off the album. Those would be Lengthwise, Maze, Fast Enough for You, The Horse, Silent in the Morning, Maze, Sparkle, and all of these songs, 7 in total, constitute almost half of the Rift album. When talking about the band's accuracy and nailing composed sections of their songs, the memory of Trey restarting a botched You Enjoy Myself was mentioned. Jeff guessed that it happened during the band's 20th anniversary show at the Fleet Center, which was played on December 2nd, 2003. As a matter of fact, it happened much earlier in the year. The botched You Enjoy Myself was actually played on January 3rd, 2003 at the Hampton Coliseum. Also about Hampton, Jeff talks with nostalgia about how many times he hung out with the Phish.net crew at Hampton in their shows at the mid and late 90s, although he couldn't exactly remember how many times the band played the Coliseum toward the middle and late 90s. The fact check on that is the band played one night in 1996, 2 nights in 1997, 2 nights in 1998. While talking about Gamehendge, I thought that the band had played the whole narrative 4 times. Jeff immediately corrects me and knows right away that it's been performed 5 times. He's correct, and those performances were March 2nd, 1998 at Nectar's, October 13th, 1991, my 9th birthday, at the North Shore Surf Club in Olympia, Washington, March 22nd, 1993 at the Crest Theater in Sacramento, California, June 26th, 1994 at the Municipal Auditorium in Charleston, West Virginia. That is the famous Game Hoist show. And then, of course, today's show, July 8th, 1994 at Great Woods. Jeff mentioned that Phish brought the Reverend Jeff Moser on tour with them later in 1994 during the fall. For those who may be unaware, Jeff Moser was a member of the Aquarium Rescue Unit, who was in Phish's orbit as early as 1990. Moser joined Phish on tour for a period during the fall of 1994. Moser helped the band arrange themselves on acoustic instruments. He also helped them solidify their interest in and performances of bluegrass and American roots songs. To hear some of Moser's guest appearance spots during this time on stage, check out any Phish show from November 16th to November 20th, 1994. And that's it for today's episode of Attendance Bias. I'd like to thank Jeff Goldberg for joining me today, Phish.net for really coming through for today's fact check, and Phish.in for providing the recording used in today's episode. If you enjoy Attendance Bias, please support the show by leaving a rating and a review of the show on your favorite podcast app. Also, please find Attendance Bias on Twitter, Instagram, anywhere on social media. You can reach out to me for a free sticker. I'm happy to give them out. Spread the word however you can about the show. Thank you again for listening, and I'll see you next week on Attendance Bias.